Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be looking at the uncertainty in uncertainty with my guest, Arsène Louis, who's an Associate Director for Quantitative Modeling with the ratings team. Arsène, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Eric.
And it's great to have you on. We've talked in the past about some of the different aspects of really understanding different aspects of risk. And you've been doing some work about really trying to put some definition behind some of the levels of uncertainty. And we think about what the overall sort of risk perspective is for any kind of environment. I'm curious, what are the pieces that you've been working on, and what are your perspectives on how we can tackle what is a really complex issue?
Well, maybe I can first give a brief idea of my team because I'm in the team of Analytical Innovation and Development Group. So our team major responsibility is doing the research and development work on different kind of, let's say, quantitative modeling, especially in the credit risk aspect. And we spend a lot of time looking into different type of data and the traditional one and also the alternative one, and then using different type of machine learning approach to build a model which can help our user to perform their risk management job. So in the past, we have built a lot of different credit risk model. So maybe we can first go into the definition of different type of the model in, let's say, credit risk aspect. So as we all know that, so the quantitative model can broadly classified into two major categories. So one is the deterministic one, and other one is the probabilistic one. So you can think of a deterministic model is a model that is fully determined by the input variables and also the model parameters. So one of the example is a checklist approach. If you can imagine a user may have a, let's say, checklist on determine so whether they should do business with their counterparty or whether a bank should lend out their money to the client. And then so if all the boxes are checked, then they pass the test and then they do the business with them. If not, then they just restrict from doing business with them.
And it seems pretty straightforward in that sort of situation in which, you've got some pretty hard checklists, you've got some specific bars that they have to pass, pretty straightforward in terms of the analysis.
Yeah, but this is straightforward, is the benefit of the model. But at the same time, the disadvantage of this kind of approach is that you only know a yes or no answer. You don't have additional information because if we pass, then it's a yes, it's a positive outcome. If it doesn't pass the test, it is a negative outcome. Then you don't know within the customer you pass the test, so which one is, let's say, ranking higher than another. So you miss the ability to rank among the different customers. So that goes into the probabilistic model, which is also the model widely used by the industry, by bank, or even a corporate to assess their counterparty. So in the probabilistic model, not just a yes-no outcome about whether the company is a good or bad company, or whether the counterparty will default or not, but instead the model generates a probability of different state of the outcome. For example, in the most straightforward probability of default model, so the outcome is just binary, so whether the company will default or not. But knowing whether they will default or not is not enough. So we also need to know about how likely they will default. So in the probabilistic model, which is also one of the model we built in-house, we take the financial information of the corporate and then use those information to, let's say, predict what will be the 1 year probability of default of a corporate.
So you've got something to work with that actually gives you a more nuanced view of what the likelihood is of that credit risk and whether or not you move forward with the transaction.
Yeah, exactly.
So when we start thinking about what you actually build into the model, we've been talking a lot recently about data and data quality. And one of the challenges, of course, in any environment is ensuring that you've got enough data, that you've got the quality of data is where you need it to be, but even figuring out what that is, what that level of quality needs to be can be a challenge. That's something we think about, sort of how accurate the data is. It's something where that's a difficult problem to really put together. How do you start to qualify that? How do you manage it? I mean, all of this is going to contribute to the level of uncertainty and that outcome, right?
Yeah, actually, for a model, even how you carefully select the data, how you carefully select the methodology of the model, there are still some uncertainty inherent in the model. So there are several different sources of the uncertainty. So one you have just mentioned about the quality of the data, which is also known as the quality of the input to the model. So it is quite, I would say, vital in any kind of modeling. So for example, in our model, we use the financial information of the company, but you know that the financial information are not always reported in a accurate way. You can still remember, so the Enron's scandal far in the past, and then they
Oh yeah.
inflate their revenues, they hide their debt, and then they just manipulate so much on their financial.
Yeah.
So garbage in, garbage out. So if the input to the model is not accurate, then of course the output of your model is not accurate.
So well, that's one of those challenges that in terms of identifying, what that source data is and its quality, is certainly a big challenge in terms of being able to sort that out. I mean, again, reporting issues, a lot of the kinds of things of being able to really divine what the reality is behind some of those reported numbers is really that particular challenge. But I guess part of this in actually looking to build confidence in what that model is really helping to identify what that level of uncertainty is. I guess, how do you build that in, and what do you look at helping to determine what that level of uncertainty is, accounting for all of the things that can potentially throw off what that model is going to deliver?
Well, I would say that beside the data issue, so there are also some other, let's say, cause of the uncertainty in the model. So one of the uncertainty is the inherence from the, let's say, specification of your model framework. So which is the model risk of the model. So we usually measure the uncertainty of the model in terms of the, let's say, the most straightforward one. So the standard deviation of the output. So in the probability of default case, so you have one, let's say, predicted probability of default for a company, but it doesn't tell you how uncertain it is. So it can be, for example, your model tells you the company will default with a probability of default of 10% next year, but actually maybe you have a confidence interval, let's say from 5 to 20. So which is a large range. But if you compare to a model which also gives you a probability of default of 10%, but the confidence interval is just, let's say, 8% to 12%, then of course the second model have a, let's say, smaller variation in the model output. So which is hard to, let's say, measure it if we are not carefully decide our model at the beginning when we build our model,
Uh,
which is not something that you can, let's say, figure out or measure afterward, but you have to keep in mind at the early stage of your model development as well.
So this is something where really you've got to build in to the model,
Yeah.
an expectation of that level of uncertainty. You've got to be able to understand what the quality of that data is, be able to build error bars based on it, and that whole level of the confidence interval. Those are going to be your error bars and output. You've got to be able to understand what the uncertainty is in both the data, in the model, and how you're accounting for it. Is that something where you're typically looking at evaluating models once they've been built? Is it mostly something where you're looking at upfront assessments? How do you actually work and build with a model? We've had a number of different discussions on the podcast about really understanding model behavior and performance, and a number of different ways in which you can actually start to either tune the model, manage it over time, or scrap it and rebuild it, depending upon what those outcomes happen to be.
Well, I would say it is more relevant to the model design than the model performance because at the beginning of the model development, we have to keep in mind what is the use case of the model. For example, if the use case of the model is just I want to use it to distinguish whether I want to do business with the counterparty, then the deterministic model, as I described at the beginning of the podcast, is already sufficient. But of course, if I want to rank the counterparty when I distinguish the good one from the bad one, then of course, then we need to change the design of the model to support this kind of generating the probability of the default status or not. And then if we further want to, let's say, enhance a model to support the different status of the future and to incorporate the confidence interval or the variation in the model output, then we have to consider it from the beginning as well. For example, one of our model is the credit model. So in our credit model, so we are not having just a binary state in the output, so default or not, but instead we are using 18 different states of credit score. So a credit score is a lowercase letter, so which is similar to the S&P global ratings. Let's say the ratings are from the AAA and then double A plus and double A minus to the triple C, double C, and C. And then with 18 status in our credit model rather than a binary outcome, so default or not, we are able to achieve a more granular output in the model. So we can assign a different probability to each status. And then in the end, we achieve a distribution of different status. And of course, different credit score. So if it is similar or if it is aligned with the S&P global rating, then we can know what will be the implied probability of default of each credit score, which means that we obtain a probability distribution of different probability of default. Then with the distribution, of course, we can measure many different property out of it: expected value, standard deviation, confidence interval, different quantile.
Interesting. So you've got the ability to at least provide a little bit more insight and hopefully a little more confidence in managing what are these, relatively uncertain inputs in terms of making that decision.
Yeah.
And when you start looking at the way in which this is really, actually applied, what are the ways in which you actually start to integrate a lot of the bigger picture things? I mean, you've got upfront data like credit ratings, a lot of the general corporate performance kinds of numbers, but there are big picture aspects that you've got to be able to pull in together as well. Because, of course, some of this is going to get influenced by, as we have seen just recently, by the state of the economy and changes in big picture things like the macroeconomic situation can start to influence this. How do you start to build that into the model? Is that a more dynamic aspect? I mean, what are the ways in which you can start to account for a lot of the real world issues that start to come into play over time?
Well, incorporating the state of the economy in the credit risk assessment is a very challenging task. And then, so one of the approach is, as you can clearly imagine, is our credit model based on the input. So the input can be, let's say corporate specific. So the financials are about the company, let's say the market capitalization of the company. If we want to incorporate the a macroeconomic factor into it, the straightforward approach is we just incorporate the macroeconomic factor into the model input. So to see how the model input, let's say the financials of the company, will respond to the state of the economy, let's say the GDP growth, the unemployment rate, the inflation. This is a approach easy to imagine, but hard to execute.
Yeah. Well, now you get into some really complicated issues of you mentioned capitalization. Okay, you've got an organization that's well capitalized. Hopefully, they're able to withstand more economic pressure. But again, maybe there are nuances to that are hard to integrate in the model.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can imagine every corporate respond differently to the, let's say, macroeconomic condition. So you are not able to develop a single model we can fit every industry and every country and every corporate. So this kind of approach is, let's say, difficult to build. So instead, you can still remember, so a corporate model is just, let's say, to capturing the relationship between some corporate specific, let's say, factor with the credit risk. So instead of directly stressing the input factors of the model, so we try to incorporate the new information from the economy into the model while a Bayesian approach. So a Bayesian approach is just updating the probability distribution with the new information you have. So you can imagine, so our model first give you a power guess on what will be the distribution of the credit score of a company. And then with the Bayesian approach, so the new information you observe or the new information you forecast about the state of the economy, then it goes into the likelihood function. And then with that approach, you can update your belief to obtain the posterior estimation on the distribution of the credit score. So this is exactly the methodology we employed in our macro scenario model. So our macro scenario model is a model that allows the user to analyze the financial and non-financial corporate, how their, let's say, counterparty credit risk may change with respect to the future macroeconomic condition using the Bayesian inference approach.
Got it. And Bayesian inference basically gives you the ability to really provide sort of that reassessment to cycle back through with additional perspectives.
Yeah.
But when we talk about additional perspectives, this is something that the credit analytics team has been working with the economic and country risk team from IHS Markit. This is one of these nice big picture synergy things that's come with the integration of the IHS Markit team. So you've got economic and country risk that starts to feed into this as well. How does that fit?
Well, when you talk about the synergy project between our credit analytics and IHS Markit, I would say first, in our credit analytics, we have a full arsenal of different kind of credit risk model. But one of the challenge in our model is, especially in our macro scenario model, so it requires the user to provide a forecast about the future. Otherwise, if you don't provide a forecast about the future, you cannot update your conditional on that economics condition. So users always tell us, they know our model was built using a long history of historical data, but sometimes they just don't find a way to use it because they have no idea about the future. They are not economists. They are not expert in US GDP, not the expert in the US unemployment, the job market, so not the expert in the foreign exchange. So the ECL team from the IHS Markit, they are a group of experts in economic analysis. So there are a group of economists, and then every quarter, they just look into the latest information they have with several assumptions about the future economies according to their expertise. And then they come up with a baseline scenario, so which tells you what will be the evolution of different macroeconomic factors in the future. For example, they give you the GDP growth, unemployment rate, they give you the inflation. And then in our synergy project, we incorporating those factors as the input, and then we pre-populate it for our user. So the user will not need to, let's say, supply their own forecast in the macroeconomic factors anymore when they use our model.
So now you've got the ability to have scenario-based forecasts that start to get integrated, so that you can look for whatever those particular scenario eventualities are and integrate them into the risk model when you're actually doing the analytics.
Yes.
So I'm curious about how this all comes together. There are a few things that you've been working on about some of these big picture real world pieces. And I'm curious about some of the use cases and some specifics about what you've actually put together. I guess you were doing some work on the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah. So one of the use case of this synergy project is exactly about the Russian-UK war case study. So last year, around February, and then everyone was surprised by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And at that time, the development of the war and also the impact of different industry and country were highly uncertain. And that every investor and that every corporate were trying to figure out, so what will happen to their portfolio, what will happen to their counterparty. And on, I think, around the late March last year, the ECL economy published the 2022 Q1 baseline scenario, which factor in the early phase of the Russian-Ukraine war, as well as the response, which was the sanction imposed by the United States, the European Unions, and other countries against Russia as a whole or on the Russian businesses. And subsequently, so after the publish of the baseline scenario, the economists also published the two additional scenarios. So one is called the Russian war optimistic scenario, which give the most possible outcome at the information that was available at that time. And another one is a scenario called the Russian isolation scenario. So this scenario was based on the assumption it will be a disaster for the Russian economy, and every country in the world will cancel their business with Russian, and then the impact will spread to the other country in the world. So with these two scenarios published roughly April last year, and then we prepare a case study using the two scenarios, and then together with the baseline, so three scenarios in total, using our macro scenario model and stress the survivability of default of different industry in the major economy, such as in US or in the European Union country. And we also published a thought leadership blog on this topic, and we describe in quite details about the outcome of the analysis. So what will be the impact of the war and then under the two scenarios, and then
Yeah, well, I think it's important to identify. I mean, this is really that classic scenario analysis, which is that it's not forecasting the future, because much as though we would like to all have a crystal ball, they're pretty hard to come by. But being able to at least identify what are particular outcomes, what are the scenarios that you want to be able to account for. That's that scenario analysis piece of being able to take a look at, well, here's where this path heads, and here's what the outcomes are. Here's a separate path and scenario that has different kinds of outcomes, but at least to ensure that when you do the analysis, you've got an understanding of what are these possible futures, and how can you account for them? How can you manage the risk that they create? How can you really deal with what are those potential impacts? It's a fascinating field when you start looking at what you can potentially do and how you manage risk in what I think we would all agree are some pretty uncertain times.
Yeah. I would say the most beautiful part of the Synergy project is not just the predefined scenario generated by the ECL economists, because the ECL data is not a statistical data set. It is a dynamic tool. So the user of this ECL data tool can incorporate their own belief. If you don't have any confidence in our economy, at least I'm quite confident on that, then you can supply your own belief on maybe on your own stress. Yeah, then you can create your own scenario with the ECL tool. And then, of course, our model is always on the platform. And then with the news and maybe your own defined scenario, you can continue to use our model, and it will give you what will be the transition in the credit risk under your own defined scenario as well.
Well, I mean, that's really the beauty of a really comprehensive scenario analysis, right? It's being able to define at least a reasonable set of potential outcomes, and then ensure that you've got whatever backstops, whatever protections, whatever controls in place to be able to manage, the outcomes in any of these environments. Always sort of interesting. We do those on the technology side, in terms of technology direction. And always interesting to see sort of what that set of possible realities are for the future. But not quite a crystal ball, but at least we can quantify what the potential outcomes are out there.
Yes.
Wow, this is fascinating, Arson. Especially when you start thinking about what the applications are, and the fact that we're looking to be able to manage what are very uncertain times. It's great to hear that we're putting together capabilities that now are starting to integrate and feed with each other, to see some of those synergies that I think we'd all sort of expected with a combination of our various organizations, and to be able to get to a point at which we can build confidence in that larger environment and in the transactions that underpin everything we're trying to do. Well, this has been great. Many thanks, and I appreciate all of the perspectives. But we are at time, and that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. I want to thank our audience for staying with us, and thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Ethan Zimmon, and Syed Waji Abbas on the marketing and events teams, and our studio team, Kyle Canulosi, Derek Brown, and Darren Rose. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about fintech, financial technologies in the Asia Pacific region. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.